Welcome back to the People's Basics and today's episode of the People's Platform, where we talk to you, the members of the community, about your top issues and how we turn them from ideas into execution. With us today on the program, we're going to be talking to Duran. But before we get into that conversation, we want to remind you all that you can join these conversations yourself and talk about your top issues by checking the description section down below and clicking through our Linktree link. Also, we want to remind you all, please make sure that you're subscribed so that you're always notified when these new conversations come out. Without further ado, let's bring on Duran to the program. Jordan, welcome to the People's Basics.
Hi there, John. Hi there, everybody at the People's Basics. It's good to be here, and I can't wait to talk to John and get his input on different issues and getting to interact with both him and the community a little bit more as time progresses.
Well, we're glad to have you here, Jordan. So we always love to introduce the new friends to the audience. Could you let people out there know where you're from, what you do, and how you politically identify?
So I'm from northern New Jersey, so not too far from John, and I am currently a transport aide at a hospital in northern New Jersey, and I'm going to be going back to school in the winter to get my master's in political science with a concentration in international relations and foreign affairs. And
Ooh,
politically, I identify as a Marxist. Anybody familiar with left Twitter probably knows me better as JJ is a Marxist. and it's funny because if you remember, when we first started interacting, I was actually a member of Rose Twitter. I also identified as a social democrat when we first started interacting, I believe.
Mm-hmm. So, Jordan, do you mind helping people who might not understand the definition? Because depending on people's political identification, sometimes they have wildly different definitions of what Marxism, socialism, etc. means. Could you give us a little bit more of a definition of what you mean when you say identifying as a Marxist?
So, by identifying as a Marxist, I believe in a classless, stateless society. However, the key difference between a Marxist and an anarchist is I believe in building up the state apparatus to a point where people's basic needs can be met, and eventually, over time, people start to develop into self-sustaining communities, and eventually it's what the concept of the withering of the state society or state apparatus or abolition of the state apparatus and state society entails. And the key difference with that is that whereas Marxism is gradually over time developing into that concept, anarchism, which is the other tenet of communism, is about immediately going into it and completely forming an autonomous state or area. Well, I don't want to say state. I think I just got a lot of anarchist Twitter very angry, but it's when you immediately try to form a classless, stateless society, and there's no real development or grace period into that historically.
Okay, so it's essentially somewhat of a reformist kind of approach to achieving a more classless, stateless society from basic needs being satisfied. We could certainly agree with the basic needs part, but I'd love to ask what the appeal in having those tenets are. Why we want to have classlessness and what does that actually mean? Why do we not want to have a state in helping determine certain decision making? And why we don't want to have money as a form of, facilitating bartering. What about those things are negative in your opinion?
Okay, so the one thing I would say is it might be reformist after the fact, but it is definitely a concept that more likely than not requires a revolution in order to get off the ground. I won't sugarcoat that. But no, I think that, because here's the thing: when you look at our society is a great example of this, is that when class fundamentally exists, you have to understand that functionally speaking, that creates a conflict. And within class, there ends up being different conflicts that entail different socioeconomic boundaries. An example is, think about the most timeless conflict, I would argue, is class. Is that fundamentally you have the really wealthy, and in America and all across the world, you also have different minorities who, because they're a minority, they are persecuted and they are treated as part of the lower class. So that's kind of where analysis can be attributed, is that it depends. I think the fundamental question to that is, what does class mean to you? Do you
Mhm.
relate it to wealth, or do you relate it to the sociological factors at play? That's why class can become kind of a loaded concept. I personally think of class as the people in charge and the people who have to deal with who's in charge. That's fun. Like, that's an easier way of putting the bourgeoisie and the proletariat into layman's terms, is who's in charge and who's not.
Mm. So, in that kind of analysis, are you essentially asserting that all decisions should be done in kind of a flat hierarchy where everyone is kind of equal in that decisioning process? Like, some of the reasons why we have kind of hierarchy is that we say certain people should be given more authority over decisions and represent more people. Do you think it should be kind of decentralized where you have direct democracy? Like, how do you kind of reach that point where you have a dissolution of class? What does that even look like in kind of practice?
Okay, so that's an interesting question, and it kind of goes back to one of the earlier points that you brought up, and that's that it goes with because the reason why I consider Marxism the long-term approach is that there are certain things that have to be done with before you can get to the final aspect of it. And to me, part of like the abolition of the commodity product, the abolition of money goes with that, because right now in America, people like to say the ruling class or the politicians have, and they control all of the power, and special interests control everything. And that's kind of where I get my idea from. And it would be direct democracy, because there's a nice little idea that I think would work really well in America. Obviously, this is very far down the line, but I think that the form of government under communism that I think would be most effective is council communism. And that is where it is a direct democracy, but there's things like tribunals, there's different councils, there's different layers. Like, there is still foundationally a hierarchy, but each person has a significantly higher say in government in council communism. And I think that particularly in America, because a key tenet of Marxism is analyzing the conditions that we all live in. And in America, we like to vote and we like to make decisions and whatnot. And I think that council communism, where it is a direct democracy and it's closer to more of a representative form of government, I believe that that would be most effective in America, because we have our long-standing history of voting, and I think that it's the most logical transition from a liberal democracy.
Hmm. So let me ask you, in some of those preconditions that are needed to kind of reach that point of establishing a system like that, what are some of those basic needs that you think we can kind of achieve currently that would enable us to kind of have that more democratic society potentially? Like, what do you see as the biggest roadblocks that we have to overcome towards what you're desiring currently?
So mind you, what I want, I don't expect to be achieved in my lifetime. I'm not going to lie about that. However, the short-term policy goals that I would like to see that I think are achievable are, and I think you might relate to this, is I personally believe that housing needs to be addressed. I think that in the richest country in the world, the fact that we have up anywhere, depending on what count you go by, we have anywhere between 5 to 10 times as many empty buildings as homeless people is unacceptable. And you're from the greater Northeast, so you understand the situation in New York right now.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think that I think the housing definitely should be some housing should absolutely be a need that is met, that the government has more than enough capability to address. And I think that if I wanted to go over another one, it would be universal health care. It would be Medicare for all. And as someone who works at a hospital, and as someone who has been in the hospital field for about 5 years now, you get a different group of stories that you end up having to deal with. And The most timeless one is always going to be for me, because I'm a transport aide, so I move them from test to test back to their room. And for some patients, I've moved them as much as 5 to 8 times in a day. And I've had a conversation with somebody where they were telling me that they were choosing to die because the funeral would be cheaper than the bills to keep them alive would have been. So healthcare is definitely near the top of my priority list as
Yeah,
well.
so I agree with you that healthcare and housing are basic needs that our people would certainly benefit from achieving. I'm curious, do you think that needs to be kind of a decentralized process or more of a federalized process? Because some of my thoughts is, if you're going to have these bigger federalized programs, how do you eventually then have that kind of translation to a dissolution of the state that you were talking about beforehand? Like, this is one of those things where I sometimes am very curious how you kind of want to go about a dissolution of the state if it's providing almost a useful service. Because like this is one of those like fundamental dichotomies we face sometimes with the left and the right. Is sometimes the right that is skeptical of government says I want to just get rid of it entirely, and the left is saying I want to have it improve and have it do useful things for people. But this seems to be more of a leftist approach where you want the government to be useful but then also to go away. How does that kind of happen? How do you go from it being useful and providing these services to no longer than needing to rely upon it?
No, and I think that that is definitely, I would say, one of the fundamental quote unquote contradictions that we really face right now. And it's a good point to bring up. Personally, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about how one of my favorite things about studying Marxism and about being a proponent of it is that you are meant to look at your material conditions and analyze them, because I've always talked about this with a lot of people, and that's that modern day communism, modern day Marxism would have to undertake a form that has never been established before, because we're post-industrial revolution, we're post the 50s and the 60s. I mean, we like to make the meme the entire time, but I mean, we have smartphones now. The society has developed to a point where you can't really, because when people talk about decentralization, they almost talk about like we're calling for a switch back to an agrarian society. And that's not necessarily the case. So what I mean by that is that with modern medicine, we have modern medicine at play. It would be counterproductive to the quality of life to people to get rid of that. So I think personally, for things like healthcare, for example, if you have a doctor, then it would be stupid to get rid of the doctor and not let him treat people. That's not how you create a better society for people. And I get that. It's more so no more private insurance getting in the way. And in my book, I personally would like to cut out the middleman. And that's my idea of universal healthcare. But I understand, given how America works, given the current healthcare infrastructure that we have, that a system like Medicare for All is the most practical, the most pragmatic, and the most effective to implement quickly.
Hmm.
And I think that eventually a system like Medicare for All can eventually be improved upon to a point where you just have a well-functioning infrastructure. And with the government, because the thing is that that implies that the government you establish later on down the line isn't going to have the people's interests at heart. Down the line, because if we're talking about formulaic or systematic form of communism being implemented, at that point, you've established a vanguard, you've established a party of people whose interests are directly related to the people that they are serving. And a good example I think you might enjoy is, in Germany with their strong labor infrastructure and their 50+1 rule, and having a regular worker on every single board meeting and council.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my idea of that is just extrapolate that concept and let ordinary people have the say. Because like I said, my end goal and my present goal are two totally different things at the moment, because I understand that my end goal is not currently feasible. And that's
I
kind
I kind of understand where you're coming from in trying to take some of those like interim steps towards getting it. Like obviously you're trying to make the incremental improvement to still have people live better lives, take the wins that we can get, but I it's one of those things where I think this is part of where a lot of people kind of have some reservations is we kind of always hear about the there's going to need this transition period, but then it's like how do you ever make that full switch? Like another part I think about when you talk about like this kind of anti-state end goal is like providing some of these basic services without the concept of certain limited population that is going to be applicable to that and doing planning for certain welfare things. I think about housing specifically because it's a more physical good compared to something like currency, which you can have some more flexibility with. Like if you have a stateless society where you don't have any borders, because that's part of what a state does is it's establishing who is kind of contained within it and has responsibility over. Anyone who comes in under theory should be guaranteed housing, but that could be a massive influx. And is it truly a guarantee if you have to wait a certain amount of time? There's a lot of like practical implications of how do you run a welfare state. It's like why certain people like a Bernie Sanders of the past formally made these statements about having some degree of, still having some degree of a border and state to be able to still have these welfare states. And that's why a lot of these kind of social democratic countries have similar practices. How do you see that like dynamic playing in the future of like trying to like dissolve the state once you've built it up? Because that's the fundamental thing that I think a lot of people, when they hear communism and they hear that idyllic goal, kind of can't get their head around. Is how do you go from a government that's been helping people so that they can finally have their basic needs secured so that they're self-sustainable to getting rid of that altogether? And I'd love to hear if you have any thoughts about the whole idea of freedom of movement, borders, and
oh,
that kind of dissolution of the state.
that's a that I love that you brought that up because ironically enough, my future PhD idea that I would like to talk about is the concept of global socialism because I fully believe that in order for this goal to be achieved, you would have to have a globalized socialist movement. Because if you've noticed historically, when one communist or one socialist country begins to prosper and develop, it pretty much does so with a target on its back. And the only way that personally I feasibly see it working in the end is the concept of global socialism. And with the social democratic countries, another thing people have to understand is that there are slight differences to the way social democracy develops. Because you have the Nordic countries that, I mean, the lightest way I can put it is a lot of the Nordic countries tend to thrive off of modern day imperialism. I mean, my favorite example of that typically is Norway. I mean, a lot of people tend to forget a lot of Norway's fortune is founded on natural resources from Africa. And it was really sad because there's this one day, I think you might have remembered that video where Norway, it was that hospital in Norway where they had the robots all over the place and everything looked very clean and very nice and very, very modern, like almost Star Trek-esque. Do you happen to remember that video in particular?
Not offhand. Do you want to bring some description to it?
So what ended up happening was that it was being shared en masse because people were like, "Wow, look at this hospital! Look at all the services that it provides." And then the same day, they were like, it had its own laundromat, it had its own robots to clean the floor. Which I mean, obviously, as a Yang supporter, I'm sure you're familiar with automation.
Yep.
um, and it was talking about how they didn't have any out of pocket costs for this, but it never talked about where that money was coming from. And the same day, there was also a video that somebody shared in the replies to that, and it was this is the tribe from Africa where these natural resources are being mined by Norway to fund their social safety net. And that village happened to be celebrating getting a new water fountain for the first time in a year. And that's my personal problem with a lot of the Nordic countries, is that, to me, all that they are doing is offloading the late stage effects of capitalism. And that is kind of my issue with it, because then you look at, like, the best way I can put it is, look at Norway, look at Finland, and look at Sweden, right? They are social democracies that have no interest in moving past that. And I mean, that's their approach. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going to be antagonistic towards them. I understand it works for them. They're very happy. But then you have a place like Bolivia, where we call them an AES country, and it's that they're trying to move towards eventually having a socialist society. And the key difference is that Bolivia is explicitly an anti-imperialist government. Like, that's the foundational, not the foundational, but a foundational aspect of their government. And you see with the election that just happened in Peru with Pedro Castillo, and that is a big focus. Is they're very committed to being anti-imperialist, and they're trying to promote worker co-ops and stronger labor rights. And that's where the similarities really begin between the global South social democracies and the Nordic country social democracies, is that although they do have very similar tenets in terms of trying to have stronger unions and trying to provide better social safety nets, it's that in the global South, they promote things like indigenous rights and things like an anti-imperialist movement. Whereas you can see why it's kind of the inverse in the Nordic countries, where a lot of them have differing forms of exploitation. Or like even in Denmark. In Denmark, I don't know if you saw that recently, where they're trying to get rid of 30% of the minority population in Denmark because of racial tensions.
Yeah, so I can agree with you that there are tenets that social democrats can probably disagree with on certain areas, and that not all forms of social democracy are going to be seen as the same. I could have a lot of disagreements with how the system currently in Scandinavia also largely still embraces a lot of means testing in its programs and work testing in its programs. There's a lot of differences that we can say, but I think there's the concept of, do you start pointing to individual actors who embrace the ideology or the theory itself? Because then you start to go to
Oh,
communism and you start to say, hey, there are certain people who embrace the label who commit atrocities. And so I think it is one of those things where it does become a conflict between implementation and real life practice compared to its finalized form. And you could say, hey, do we know what the result of these policies that they put in place of a social democratic system without that additional wealth? I don't think we can say that definitively. We know that there are certain differences in the actual taxation rates, where they tax their wealthy significantly more than most countries do. We know that they're spending more on their people than most countries do. And so, yeah, maybe it would be less if they had less wealth to be able to distribute because of that. But over time, we've also seen the global poor, the extreme poverty rate, go down significantly in the past century, and we've seen democracy spread. So I'm not going to say that all parts of what some people call imperialism, which I would just call simply also diplomacy at times. China does its own form of imperialism. It just does it with its economy. Now, I can disagree all day long with militarization and the military industrial complex, but yeah, we would like to have more people sometimes share our values. That's how good alliances occur, is when we have certain things that we can agree upon and are what keeps us together. And so I am not going to say I'm some expert on the full colonial picture of the Scandinavian countries, but I think the actual concept of having certain basic goods be socialized based on the idea that they're price inelastic, they're basic needs, and that people should not have to be price exploited for them makes sense. But then you have certain things that are commodities, that are not essential needs, that we should be still leaving to a market. And we should be having a labor system that is properly respecting labor rights and gives people a chance to have an ownership in their companies. But like, one of the problems I always have with socialism is I find it a little bit too absolutist at time, that it has to be 100% ownership, that you can't have the notion of private investment and choosing where you want to spend your money to try and say, hey, I want to grow this more. I want to take that risk, and I want to, push my own individual thought forward of what this should be. I generally have that kind of problem where I would love that we have at least 50% representation on boards by workers. But if you start pushing for 100%, I'm going to be like, that just seems like you're not leaving any wiggle room for individual groups to decide for themselves.
No, and that's fair. It brings up the conflict from earlier in the year with the whole Nathan Robinson situation about his workers trying to start a workers co-op in the company. And that's the thing, is that if the markets exist, which obviously, if you couldn't tell, they do today, the best way you can do you have to analyze the current situation of the world and understand that right now markets exist, and the best that you can do right now is, like you said, try to strengthen good labor practices, try to strengthen things like unionization, and try to get as many workers to unionize their workplace and democratize their workplace as possible. That is something that, if the market has to exist in the current society, that's why I'm always going to support any kind of labor strengthening in that regard. And you brought up China. I mean, oh man, this isn't exactly going to bode well for a lot of people in this community. But I happen to think that China is explicitly anti-labor, and it's why I think that China calling themselves the Chinese Communist Party is simply just to pass on the idea of the Chinese Revolution, which is still to this day pretty popular there. But in terms of their practice and in terms of their beliefs, they are not in any way, shape, or form communism. Communists famous for busting up labor unions. No,
Yeah.
it's not. And I think that China's not representative of communism. And let's see how far I want to dig myself. I don't believe they're moving towards socialism. I don't think that what I see going on there is representative of the kind of society that I would want in terms of their labor practices either. I mean, you have to understand, they have almost as much privatized healthcare as we do. So it gets to a point where it's like, I wouldn't use this as my hallmark situation. It's not something that I would endorse. And it's one of the biggest reasons why I appreciate calling myself a Marxist and not personally, an anarchist, is I like to look at the current conditions that I'm living in and experiencing. And what I have to understand is not one size fits all under the circumstances. And in America right now, considering that we're in late stage capitalism, we are at a point where water is tradable as a commodity on the stock market. So I think, working towards the mild social democratic platforms is progress, considering the point that we're at. I think that society needs to be looked at in a relative way. I think that another thing that we could definitely agree on is congressional term limits need to be a thing.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because I think there's nothing more infamous to me about it than, you remember when Zuckerberg was on trial in front of Congress and he had to explain to Congress how they made money off of advertisements. And he had to say, when questioned about it, Zuckerberg had to say, we use ads like in the newspaper. And the congressional delegation at that collective moment were just, wow, oh, that's how. And it kind of goes about with, I think, another thing that we overlap on, and that's with how technologically advanced the world has become. If you want your governing body to be more representative of the overall demographic, because America overall is quickly becoming younger as more and more of the older generation begins to pass away. You look at things like education, for example. I mean, think about how many first graders now are learning how to use a smartboard or getting an iPad in public schools now. The world is changing, and I think that the governing body needs to become younger. I think that it needs to be more understanding of the current world order. And I think that that's demonstrated in our foreign policy too. I mean, think about how quickly our leaders are so quick to drum up old-styled Red Scare tactics against other countries. Is another one. I think that fundamentally America is always based on polarization. It's based on trying to functionally create a literal enemy to try to distract people from our domestic concerns. And I was curious if that's something you had ever noticed or had ever thought about a little bit.
Oh, for certain. It was something I was thinking about a lot when it came to the final year last year of when Trump kind of started to get a little shady with the Iran deal and started to do the strikes against Soleimani. It was definitely some people were theorizing that was a strike from some of the concerns that we were having with the start of the coronavirus at that same time period, and that he was trying to drum up some support to rally around him for that election. So, yes, there's definitely some theater to it. I remember distinctly the moments when Trump was finally called presidential on CNN was always when he was firing missiles. I totally get that it's kind of a projection of strength that a lot of people try to show. It's a rallying point for a lot of people. Like, if you want to know the highest approval rating Congress has ever had, it happened after 9/11 because we had an enemy that we all felt like we could point at
Mm-hmm.
and did not want to challenge any loyalty narratives to our own country. So we all just sat in
Exactly.
line and agreed. So yes, I totally agree with you on that point that we drum up war often as a distraction from some of our own domestic issues here at home.
Oh, I
But
think that it goes even further than that because I remember last week it was, I believe it might have been a journalist who tried to talk about how the abortion law in Texas was, they equated it to the USSR and to Cuba, both in 2 or 3 days. And it was funny because Cuba had legalized abortion, I believe, 13 years before Roe v. Wade was put into effect. And in the USSR, they had near the beginning of the USSR, I believe it was 1927. I believe it was 1927 to 1948. They had access to abortion, and it was kind of funny because I know it comes off like a meme sometimes, but it's very common that whenever something is wrong in America, we have a tendency to equate it to either the USSR or to China or to the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, for anybody who might not necessarily understand the acronym. We have a tendency to project our own issues on countries that, if you do more research onto it, don't have these issues themselves. And I think that it's ironic that the country that was founded on the concept of personal and individual responsibility, when it comes to the faults, has a dramatic tendency to not actually take accountability for said issues.
mm,
And yeah, it's something that I tend to. It's one of the biggest reasons that it's one of the biggest concepts that has pushed me towards embracing collectivist ideologies. Is that collectivism is the best way I can put it is I prefer the idea of being part of a team and having a captain as opposed to just having a bunch of people think that they're the captain.
mm. I mean, it's interesting because I do agree with you that there is definitely advantages to the idea of collectivism. I think it's part of our inherent strength as a species is our social ability to be able to communicate ideas to one another. And that combined with our ability to have tool use is the foundation of just education and being able to build off new things and unlocking new capabilities. is our ability to work together, take stuff that's already been made and make it better to help other people's needs. Now, I can have my some disagreements on the notion of just everyone being a team. Sometimes you do need an individual who has their own understanding to be better than the just the plays that are drawn up. Sometimes, a coach doesn't always win at all. Like if we're going to use the sports analogies, rarely is it just a team without any stars that wins. You still need to have those certain stars that are kind of helping, and then you have kind of the supporting role players that are around them. But obviously, we're not going to make the full comparison on the economy to sports references here. It's a lot different, but I still even think in that realm, it's a very interesting dynamic. Coaches are valuable and can definitely be helpful, but sometimes you're not the person on the floor and feeling people's bodies of how much energy you got left to go. But Jordan, I just wanted to ask you, as we're wrapping up here in today's episode, if you have any final thoughts that you want to share with the universal people listening in, and if you got any questions for me. I always love to give our guests a chance at the very end to turn the tables on me.
All right. The first thing I'll say is for my final thoughts. First off, I appreciate you taking the time out to talk to me. I've had a very good time. You're very approachable, and I appreciate that. And you're very open-minded, and it makes you a very good conversationalist. And I think that you're very good at what you do, and I appreciate what you do here.
Oh, thank you. I
And
appreciate that.
and to the People's Basics community, all I would say is I would appreciate to continue the dialogue and to work on what we have in common and our common goals more so than our ideological differences. I mean, I understand being a Marxist living in America that I'm going to have a lot of ideological differences with the people around me. But at the end of the day, one of the root words of communism is community. And in a community, not everybody thinks the same. And I understand that and I appreciate that. And at the end of the day, all we want to do is create a better world for our kids, for our grandkids, and for every generation after us.
Full-heartedly agree
And
with that, Jordan.
and the question that I was going to have for you
Yeah.
is that since the election and since the primary cycle, my biggest question for you would be, do you feel as though you've had a shift left or right in any way, shape, or form? Do you think that you've advanced past where you were during the primary?
That's a very interesting question. I would say I've probably shifted somewhat to the left. And I think the biggest reason why that is that I think I saw how much full in drinking the Kool-Aid a lot of the Republicans were. Like it was kind of one of those things where even I during the 2016 election was like, I kind of can understand where some of these people are to maybe take a chance or a flyer on him. Now, I saw warning signs obviously too, and I didn't end up voting for him, but I kind of at least got it. Now it just felt like with basically three-quarters of the Republican Party going full in that the election was stolen and there was essentially an insurrection, I felt like it wasn't going to be possible to make it a proper bipartisan path trying to find the more moderate sounding thing to get it done. I soundly think we need to just full heartedly make the Republican ideology and party basically unelectable and something shameful to basically embrace eventually. I know that's a unrealistic goal when you got like roughly 28% of the country identifying as Republicans currently, but I genuinely think that they are a dangerous threat to America and they largely drag the Democratic Party to the right. And beforehand at that point, I was like very just pro um I was thinking a bit more pro Democrat, but I was trying to find that middle ground. Now I'm definitely more towards the left because I simply feel like that ideology needs to be fundamentally crushed. It's fundamentally dangerous to our public health. It's escalating racial tensions. There's a lot of finger pointing that can go on, but uh, I obviously have also become a little bit more disillusioned with the Democrats too, which pushed me even a little bit further to the left because they keep trying to like buckle to the people in the middle that is not a middle. It's just the freaking conservative right wing and not solving problems. Like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema never get called out by party leadership. And we are just continuing to have certain promises kind of get like spiked. Like, being someone who wasn't going to extend fossil fuel, new pipelines. We've been doing dozens of them. We're at a similar pace to what Trump was. Like, there's
We're
things
actually
like
at we're actually at the highest level of pipelines since the Bush administration. Fun fact.
yeah, and here's the thing, like a lot of people kind of fell asleep on that issue a bit because he started off like he kind of did this kind of like out the gate. Everyone remember these things. Here's my progressive measures and all my executive orders. And one of the things he did was strike down the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was the big one in every like person's mind when it came to that sort of issue. And then just kind of did the stealth ones all kind of afterwards. But genuinely seeing the Democratic Party also like this is a really simple thing, but just like to promise $2,000 and then like immediately say no, we meant 1,400 plus 600, despite that promise
Ugh.
coming after they already did the 600 and the previous one coming from a different administration. So it's not like you gave 2,000 in total. It was just like
I
all these little things adding up made me be like, I have felt trapped in the Democratic Party because of the way our election process works. The method of voting that we use gives actual spoiler effects where if you maybe vote for something that you align with more often, it is going to make it more likely that the other side is going to be able to still get a win. And, New York is a closed primary state. So if I want to have any say in the democratic process of their party, I have to be a part of the party.
I hate it.
It's very frustrating. And so, yeah, I've definitely moved a little bit left on that. I have felt a little bit more bitterness towards the Republican Party, completely hook, line, and sinker going along with Donald Trump.
I
Information
will
win.
never argue against somebody who discusses the concept of a one-party state. Wink, wink. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, destroy the Republican Party. I can. My ears perked up a little bit when I heard that because I'm quite in favor of one-party states. If you catch my drift. But
I mean, I think a one-party state, it can be effective. It can have its own abuses, and so I'd prefer, frankly, achieving a no-party state or having
Ooh,
a multi-party state. Like those are my
ooh, look at
preferences on
you! Oh my, getting a little spicy here, John. I like it. Okay.
I have a couple positions that are a bit more radical. They're not the things that I prioritize because, as you kind of said, you have to unlock some capabilities first and make ideas seem a little
Yes,
less radical.
you
But,
do. I appreciate that.
yeah, I think this is a good point to wrap up on now. Now we know a little bit of my side of saying, okay, it's in stages. But Jordan, I want to thank you so much for coming on today to talk with our community.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. So, Universal People, this is going to do it for us here at the People's Platform on the People's Basics. We want to remind you all to please join our community. Check the description section down below to get our Linktree link that has all of our links to become a member on Patreon or on YouTube. And like this video so that it helps get boosted in the algorithms online. That being said, we all hope you have a great day out there and stay classy as always, Universal People.